All right. Sorry that we're starting again late.
Those slides look familiar to you?
All right. I'm going to start now. I'm starting now. Tell Sam I'm starting now. All right. We are back, and it is 12. It looks like 20 or 25. And I'm sorry for the delay. I also noticed that there were people just getting through that lunch line as I was heading back in here. So hopefully the extra time was helpful for people's blood sugar levels. So we are back. We have two more presentations. It went long this morning. I need to remind folks that if you want to comment on this or the other item on our agenda today, you need to fill out a blue speaker's card, which Janine has. Again, information item and workshop. We won't have long comments, but brief comments, because the goal of both of these is just to throw more thoughts into the mix as we collectively move forward on this, as well as the later item today. But please have your card in so that we can estimate the time and give it to Janine Townsend or Courtney Tyler up in the front. That was a good morning. All right. Moving on. Dr. Gold, I believe you are next.
Where's the slide? Oh, there we go. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go over a research project that we've been doing at UCLA with Colorado School of Mines. The leads have been myself and Katie Micah, who's here in the audience, who probably did most of the work, and Terry Hogue at Colorado School of Mines. And so we've been looking at the city of LA as a whole in partnership with the Bureau of Sanitation, working closely with DWP and the city and the mayor's office and everyone else there, in putting together this research. We've been doing this for the last 3 years, breaking out the city into the 3 major watersheds within the city, comparing the watersheds themselves, looking at this really from the standpoint of stormwater BMPs and putting BMPs throughout the watershed and seeing what would be the optimal set of BMPs to actually get to water quality standards attainment, while also optimizing other sorts of benefits. We did a pretty thorough flow study on the LA River as well, and I'll touch upon that, and a couple of other issues as well. So this will be a snapshot of everything. You've obviously know the study area very, very well at this point, and so these are the watersheds that we were looking at, and obviously they have not only MS4 compliance issues, but TMDL issues as well. And so when we were looking at water quality standards attainment, those were the sorts of things that we were looking at moving forward. The LA River watershed itself, you've seen the descriptions. This is the monitoring setup, the various different flow gauges. We emphasized a lot of the time on the Wardlow gauge, which is at the bottom of the watershed, and so a lot of the results are there. So around 35% of the watershed is within the LA city boundary. And the measured flows that we see at the Wardlow gauge average during that 1 decade of about 274,000 acre-feet per year.
So, and the swing from high to low, do you have a sense of what that is?
I'm sorry, what?
The swing from high flow to low flow years? Do you know?
Yeah, it included both.
I know. Can you have the issue with the...
Oh, do I have the range off the top?
But it's probably in your study, right?
I don't off the top of my head.
Okay.
Yeah, because I'm sure 2006 was through the roof. And
right.
But anyways, so this is the watershed itself. As you can see, the upper third or so is heavily forested, undeveloped, mountainous, et cetera. And then some of the Santa Monica Mountains are there as well. All right, so this is the slide from hell. And the reason why we have it on there mostly is a reminder for me and what to cover. And this is just sort of a sample of what we did for each of the watersheds. We came up with probably literally thousands of different scenarios that we ran using Sustain, is the water quality modeling effort. And we were looking at both treat and release BMPs as well as infiltration BMPs. And really the major purpose of this slide is that it gives you a little bit of everything if you have time to delve into it. What we're looking at from the standpoint of compliance on the TMDLs was looking at the metals TMDL, so that's copper, lead, zinc. Copper and zinc are the biggest compliance problems within the watershed. You know this watershed, there's obviously water effects ratios that are being used in various different reaches within the watershed. We ran the analyses, including the water effects ratios as well, and looking at this. This, of course, is looking at the ward low gauge, which is at the bottom, and you can see the types of BMPs that we looked at. What's important is that really in looking at this is that you have to look at it from the standpoint of every watershed's different, and so what you do within the LA River to try to get to water quality standards attainment might be completely different than what you do in Dominguez and different than what you do in Bayona. And we've seen too often this assumption that it's one size fits all when it's really one size fits none. And so really trying to tailor it specifically. The other thing is in the work that we did, we found that the cost data, I know you guys hear a lot of testimony on how much everything costs. The amount of cost data that was out there that we relied on was really poor. So from the standpoint of what you would actually rely on costs for BMPs, we spent a huge amount of time and effort to really try to get that information. It's something I think CASQA, for example, has been saying that they've wanted to do since 2002 or 2003. They've never done it. And so the end result is, we did the best we could, getting some data from Prop O projects, some data from the county on Public Works, but there really isn't a good database for the state as a whole on what the cost of various different BMPs are when you're really trying to put these distributed BMPs throughout the built environment. And so anyone who says there is not telling you accurate information. And so the ranges that we saw in costs often were factors of 3 or more for the sorts of BMPs that we were looking at. And these are, as you can tell, the smaller distributed ones was the approach. So you get ideas on cost. We also looked at the issues of how much we're reducing peak flows. And so like infiltration is obviously going to be much better on that than treat and release sorts of BMPs. And then the other thing, also on cost, things like porous pavement costs a heck of a lot more than an infiltration trench or bioretention or vegetated swale. And so that pops out pretty much as well in this sort of information. And then the other thing is the nature of how a TMDL is written can also lead to compliance issues in a pretty serious way, where you wouldn't really think that, infiltration is what we really want to do because we want to maximize infiltration into groundwater basins. But infiltration doesn't give you the benefit of treat and release from the standpoint of compliance with the concentration component of a TMDL. So that's something that you might not think of it reduces loads, but it's not going to help you on concentrations. You're still going to have the same concentration running through the watershed. And so that's something that I think often perhaps that sort of subtlety and nuance isn't really looked at. And so that's something that we took a hard look at as well. I know that's sort of a weird concept. Did that make sense to everybody?
I was wondering if you could just take an example of something that works. Maybe just walk through an example where you look at all these different factors and things seem to sort of line up.
Yeah, give the narrative wing of the board a sense
Okay,
of,
so look at
we've lost our engineers today, so who see a story in a graph. Give us a story.
Right. Yeah. This is my cheat sheet for notes. But anyway,
you can speak this language. Yeah.
So what you see as an example, right, would be 2A is VS plus DP. So that's vegetated swales plus dry ponds.
Right.
And so those are treat and release sorts of BMPs, right? So they're not infiltration. And so you would look down there, and the darker green is better in how it performs compared to the rest of the slide, where the lighter green or the white means that it performs not as well. And so if you look at the amount of infiltration, you can see that 16.4% is a lot less than 23.6%, where you have infiltration trenches or porous pavement, where you're going to do a much better job on that. And so on infiltration and on peak flow reduction, since those are treat and release BMPs, they're going to have less of an impact there. So that's why you only see a 29% reduction as opposed to 55% as you see in some of these others. But then you get to compliance on dry weather TMDLs and concentrations as well as load-based, and it performs quite well in comparison to the other ones. And that's because you get this sort of dilution factor, if you will, of you treat polluted water, what comes out is clean water, and that comes back into the river. So that means you have less exceedances in the receiving water. But at the same time, the trade-off is you don't get as much water that infiltrates into the ground to augment your groundwater supply.
It's like the ultimate final exam question, isn't it? Because you have to trade off all of these.
You need a
different
real
things.
big blue book to come up with the right answer. Yeah, absolutely. And so anyway, so that's just to sort of walk you through what this tells you. And so we did not, in doing this, say this is the best answer, because the reality is, if I say what the best answer is, it's subjective, right? Because if I really want water quality standards attainment, and that's all I care about, I might choose vegetated swales and dry ponds. But if I really care about flood control benefits and I care about groundwater supply, then I wouldn't be choosing that. And so that's what's really important about this, is it gives you as regulators and these guys as decision makers and watershed managers the information necessary to make the right decision for their cities and for their watersheds. Does that make sense? Cool. All right, so we did the same thing for Baiona. I won't bore you with the details there. It's much easier to get to compliance in Baiona Creek than the LA River. By far the hardest is Dominguez Channel. The reason why is Dominguez Channel, much less open space, highly industrialized. The sorts of information that we use for modeling, we use the water quality data in the modeling is what are called event mean concentrations, which was a study that was done about 15, 20 years ago, looking at various different land uses and what sorts of pollutant concentrations and loads you would expect from an industrial land use versus a residential land use versus transportation, those sorts of things. In Dominguez, because it is so highly industrialized, and what we've seen in the data that was turned in for the industrial stormwater permit in the SMARTS database, is that the water quality coming off of a lot of those facilities is way worse than the typical industry that you would see. So that's another thing to sort of take into account as well. So Dominguez and their ability to get to water quality standards attainment will be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. And literally, if you set the pollutant loads of 0 for industry, you still won't get to water quality standards attainment in Dominguez. So that shows you how difficult it would be there. All right, Machado, a little bit different, but we also looked at nutrients there because they had nutrients and so nitrogen and phosphorus issues. The big take home on Machado is that water quality standards attainment can occur, but it's going to be very difficult. And here this brings up the regulatory issue of what happens when you have a receiving water body that's totally in one city of Los Angeles, but the vast majority of pollutant loads are coming from other cities. And so what can LA do to ensure that the waste load allocations are actually being met upstream is going to be a huge challenge. And it's not going to work unless the state board and the regional board really make sure that those upstream cities are doing their part. And if they do their part, then you can get to water quality standards attainment at Machado Lake, which would be really important since the city has invested $140 million in completely redoing Wilmington Drain and Machado Lake in a pretty extraordinary project. All right, so so the sorts of things that we looked at 85th percentile storm in LA River, since that's obviously another way to get to water quality standards attainment. What we found was a lot of times when you get to 85th percentile, where you capture 100% of the 85th percentile storm in a watershed, doesn't mean that the actual numeric water quality standards are met in receiving waters. And so that was something that we found in our modeling as well. So it's obviously great if the regulated community does go to that point, but don't expect that they're not going to have any exceedances of water quality standards in the receiving waters. And so just realize it's sort of a functional equivalent, but there's a big issue. The peak flow reduction, based on the various different scenarios, you can reduce that by 29 to 57% within the LA River. So obviously BMPs have a huge impact there from a flood control benefit, and so that's pretty good as well. Our modeling analyses focus primarily on placing BMPs on public lands, but remember, private lands are a big part of the solution as well with low impact development ordinances, and so we actually took a look at that as well. I'm not going to get into this in any detail, but the studies that we looked at as well, we were looking at groundwater and recycled water potential in West Basin, Central Basin, as well as Upper LA, the Upper LA River aquifer as well, and the various different ways to maximize potential on groundwater recharge and groundwater storage and pumping rights are some of the things we talked about within that study. Yeah, oh great, I'm in a big hurry. All right, what makes up the LA River flows? I think you got a lot of that earlier today, so I wanted to jump into the meat of the study and what it shows here. So this specific table demonstrates what the modeling baseline flows are in the various different seasons at the bottom of the LA River, and you see substantial, roughly 50% reduction in flows when you implement BMPs on a watershed-wide basis, and so that's something to take a look at. We've increased runoff ratios absolutely dramatically over time, and this is what this figure is all about, is you sort of look at 1950, and this is sort of an inch of rain and how much of that, what percentage of that inch of rain will end up going into the receiving waters. As you can tell, a lot of paving of the watershed over time, the runoff ratio is going to increase dramatically. You put all the BMPs in place, and that gets you back to around 1950. And so that sort of shows you, that doesn't mean pre-development, but a lot of the development within the watershed. And it also gives you an idea of how much we've really impacted our watershed in a big way. This figure is pretty compelling. It gives you an idea of how flows of the historic seasonal annual minimum flows in the LA River have increased over time. And this is obviously because you can see where the water recycling plants kicked in the time frame. In our modeling, we took a look at what happens when the BMPs are implemented watershed-wide and you actually utilize 0% of the water, the recycled water from the treatment plants all the way to 100% of the water. And as you can see, with the 100%, you pretty much have your minimum flows are 0. And so this is your worst case scenario from the standpoint of aquatic life and recreational use. But it does show you if you had a situation where everyone tried to get to water quality standards attainment and you tried to maximize water recycling and use every drop, the end result would be you'd have no flows for a significant part of the year within the LA River, which means you would absolutely eliminate those beneficial uses that are dependent on those low flows. And so that's really what this is all about, and this sort of gives you the range of variability with the various different scenarios that occur there. And these are the low flows. This is a term, 7Q10, defined as the lowest average discharge over a period of 1 week with a recurrence interval of every 10 years. And you see how those flows have increased dramatically within the LA River after Tillman came on board. And so that's something where, pre-1985, your average was 42.2 for your very low flows, and now it's 157 CFS. So that's a pretty substantial difference. And the thing is, Arroyo Seco, which didn't, and this is upstream in the Arroyo Seco, kind of above JPL, is that you see that the 7Q10 has pretty much remained constant during that entire time period. So it shows you the difference that you have a developed watershed with recycled water versus one that's a tributary, and you really see haven't much change. And so the conclusions, I think, are pretty clear from the standpoint of that we need to find a middle ground on what we're doing from the standpoint of the future of the LA River. Trying to go back to what the hydrologic regime was in the 1800s obviously would be extremely difficult and very, very different than what we have today. You've seen the changes over time since the 1950s versus where we are today. And clearly there needs to be a study on what are the optimum flows needed to maintain beneficial uses seasonally one of the things that should definitely be looked at, for example, is you have recreational flows of kayaking that are only 3 months a year. So does that mean that, as an example, you might have the water recycling plants can maximize their water reuse for 9 months a year, but during the 3 months a year that you have kayaking, you might want to have different flow limits for them. That's just an example. The same sort of thing, studies need to be done, especially on aquatic life, on what do you really want LA River aquatic life to thrive there, from the standpoint of what makes the most sense from a biodiversity perspective, and that sort of study really needs to be done. I highly urge the State Water Board and the Regional Water Quality Control Board to work together and sort of run that effort. I think because you don't have a stake in the outcome other than trying to optimize protection of the beneficial uses, then it makes sense that you two would be the right entities to do so, as opposed to a permittee, which obviously is going to have a different stake in the outcome. And so these are the sorts of things that should be looked at within that study. And one thing, just in conclusion, is, which I think it just is a good news thing, is on low impact development on the private side, is that what you can see is that just the fact that, it doesn't cost cities, it doesn't cost the state, and it impacts new and redevelopment and making sure that we do it in a much sounder way. And you get a pretty tremendous water supply and water quality benefit in doing so. And so this just sort of tells you what that benefit is over time. 2028 is the metals TMDL deadline, one of the metals TMDL compliance deadlines. And so you sort of see that could literally save, hundreds of millions of dollars for the permittees within the watershed by having a really good lid ordinance. And boy, you get to the point where you have lid requirements for new, for transportation improvement projects, like a street improvement of a certain scope and scale, and that number would get a heck of a lot bigger. And so that's something that the State Water Board should really take a hard look at as well, and saying we should be moving more towards green streets in the future. And I think we'll skip over the rest of this because I think I'm out of time, right? Okay, so there's a lot more to it, just to let you know, without getting into this, but we even got to the point of sort of looking at, how far the city of LA could get towards, right now, imported water. During the height of the drought, they had 89% imported water from more than 200 miles away. And how do you maximize that, And so we looked at everything from Mayor Garcetti's recommendations of, trying to reduce imported water by 50% in 2035, to even taking to the extreme of what happens if you turn Hyperion into a water recycling plant, advanced water treatment plant, and how far can you get? And believe it or not, you can get pretty close to self-sufficiency if you get conservation down to 75 gallons per capita per day inclusive, which is done in a lot of the world. Not too many cities here, but I know you guys went over that yesterday, and nobody's saying that you would have to get down to, the levels of, South African cities are trying to get to 22 gallons per capita per day because of their drought. But 75 is something that's not completely out of the imagination to do by 2050 or so. Anyways, thanks for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, that's great. Thank you for putting the water quality piece on deck.
Sure.
They're different worlds sometimes, so it's all connected.
Oops.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let me know if you have any other questions.
Phil.
Hi, my name is Mike Affelt from the City of Los Angeles, and I'm in Mayor Eric Garcetti's Office of City Services, where I'm the director of the LA River Works team. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here on such a distinguished, if I put my microphone on. Sorry, let me start again. Again, my name is Mike Affelt, work for the City of Los Angeles in Mayor Eric Garcetti's Office, City Services. I'm the director of the LA River Works team, focused on LA River all day, every day. Really appreciate the chances to speak here. It's a pleasure to be on such a distinguished group of speakers. So thank you, Chair Marcus and board members and staff. So what I'd like to offer you is sort of an overview of LA River from sort of our revitalization standpoint, which is a pretty multifaceted, big picture goals for the river. that cover everything from obviously the water issues that we're discussing today, in addition to recreation and economic development and the role of the river within the community. So does everyone know where the LA River is after today? I think probably we've seen this map a few times. So obviously the river runs 51 miles, 32 of which are in the city of LA. So that's our purview primarily, although of course we have a watershed eye. The political context of the river, which obviously we've partly discussing today, is a bit complex. Of course, the LA is 32 miles, and we've heard from Burbank and Glendale today. Then south of LA, there are another dozen plus cities through which the river runs. And then within the city of LA, the river runs through 8 of our 15 council districts, which is a majority. As we've seen, the nature of the channel in its engineered state varies dramatically, even within over the course in San Fernando Valley. Narrow box channel through the Glendale Narrows with the existing vegetation, armored banks, but a stabilized earthen bottom, and then of course downtown and much of the lower river is fully concrete, and then until you get down to the estuary. So I think we understand the character of the river. I'm just going to cycle through the valley, Glendale Narrows, downtown, lower river, and of course down at the Port of Long Beach. I often point out to folks, and I don't need to point out to this room, I'm sure, since everyone is an expert, but LA is this, downtown LA where we are now is 15 miles-ish inland from the ocean, and that's because of the LA River. Of course, everyone in this room probably knows that well, but that's actually something that opens the eyes of many audiences I have the opportunity to speak with. We're not like many other coastal cities. And so, the river as a drinking water source and an irrigation source was obviously critical throughout its development until we got to our channelization era. Again, I don't need to dwell on that, I'm sure. The river also runs through many disadvantaged communities that was touched on earlier as well. That's not a coincidence for many reasons, as industry grew along the banks, and some of the impacts of that have had an effect on communities over the decades. So our focus again is primarily 32 miles within the city of LA of the 51-mile corridor. Almost 1 million people live within a mile of that 51-mile corridor of the river. 400,000 plus within the city itself. So we're talking about a huge set of constituents and stakeholders. So from the city of LA's perspective, after the channelization era, and then later on the movement led by advocates to reimagine what the river's role would be in our lives, the city of LA decided to follow in the footsteps of others and the county and develop a master plan to envision what the river would look like, what its function might be, what might be occurring along its banks, and wrote that report in 2007, the LA River Revitalization Master Plan. So again, it's multifaceted. It talks about environmental responsibility, equity from social and environmental justice perspectives, community engagement, sustainable economics from the system-wide perspective. And the plan imagined changes to the physical form of the river, considered things like terracing, strategic habitat rehabilitation, in some areas more ambitious than others. And so that has resulted, many things, our plan and many other efforts working sort of in parallel in kind of a network, have resulted in a lot of projects that are built and existing today that people are enjoying, and that have certain sets of function to them. One, I just have a couple examples in this slideshow. The Epi Reyes Riverway in Lincoln Heights community is a great example of one of these multifaceted projects that has been already implemented along the LA River. So this project daylighted a storm drain that was below ground, The water that was, stormwater was flowing through that system is now running through this sort of a vegetated swale kind of setting that has a pretty hefty set of engineering that goes along with it too, with trash separation, et cetera. And then couple that with native habitat trails where people can come enjoy the project. It's a very good example of the kind of multi-purpose project that we, the city, and many others are implementing along the river. Another example from the city's portfolio is at the North Atwater Park area, and its expansion a few years ago, and a creek restoration that went along with that, right? So this wasn't a daylighting project like the previous project where there was an underground storm drain, but there was a sort of V-channel outflow to the river that was essentially concrete and of very little habitat value. And this project restored native habitat, and it's thriving. It's doing very well, and well used by the community. Because access to nature is one of the primary focuses of our plan and our goals and our vision for the future. We obviously see the LA River as a natural and cultural resource that should be at the center of our lives in LA in many ways, or we have the opportunity to sort of reclaim its place at the center of our lives in many ways. So those are some of the projects that we have executed. There are many, many others. This slide actually here is an overview of a pretty grand, ambitious effort that was mentioned a few times earlier with the federal government, with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. That's called the Arbor Project, which, Evelyn, you got the acronym right. I was very impressed. The Arbor Project. Mm-hmm. It's an 11-mile project that was developed, the study was developed over 10 years with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We're 50-50 partners in that, with the city as a local sponsor, the non-federal sponsor. So it covers that area that's sort of in the box there, and on the right side are some of the artistic renderings of strategies and opportunity areas that study identified to do some native riparian restoration for the specific purpose of ecosystem restoration as the primary goal. Top picture is a confluence of the Verdugo Wash meets the LA River. Rather ambitious vision there to remake that area. Next picture down on the right side is imagining of what some terracing could look like in sort of maintaining a structured armored bank, but integrating some habitat into that. Below that is the G2 area, which I'll get to in a minute. And then below that is a rendering of what could possibly exist at the current LA Trailer and Container Facility of Union Pacific, an active rail yard, but maybe down the road could be a really major area, 100 acres, that we could restore. Long way away from that, but it is one of our goals.
Is all of that within public property?
So no, this study actually didn't. The study did attempt to prioritize public lands because that's obviously going to be the land that it's going to be easier to move on, but really tried to look at opportunity areas like confluences that irrespective of the ownership, because we're sort of looking at the function that we're trying to that we would hope to implement. So a mix of public and private, but what was not included specifically is residential. So no one's home is within the footprint.
How about specifically on that terracing? That looks interesting.
So the terracing, it's sort of a typology that's imagined for the banks, and the banks are there are places in which there is underlying private ownership beneath the river and its banks, but everywhere essentially it is controlled by a public entity, whether it's the county or the Army Corps. In this 11-mile area, it's pretty much all controlled by the Army Corps. So we get into, there'd be definitely some detail work in terms of property rights there, but essentially it's under public control generally. It's a mishmash. So this big study, I'll just spend a little more time on this because it's I think super relevant to this conversation. Imagined over 700 acres of potential habitat restoration opportunities. And that habitat obviously is going to have some demand of flows from the river, or from other sources, from runoff, from the watershed, from potentially recycled water irrigation during establishment periods, et cetera. It is one of the focal points, though, in discussions, internally within the city with DWP and with others, regarding trying to get some kind of handle on future demand. And we don't know exactly how much. I'll just be blunt about it. We don't know how much of this plan ultimately will be fully built. It's a $1.4 billion program, and some of it is in the hands of private parties, which are not yet willing sellers. But we're going to endeavor, sort of in an adaptive way, to get a handle on how much of this we project will be built. In the near term, we have identified the first phase of the actual design and implementation. So we completed the study in 2016, adopted it at City Council, and it was also authorized by Congress and signed by President Obama before he left office, as part of a larger package of legislation. And now we have just, with the Army Corps and with approval from our City Council, identified the first piece that we're going to design, which is a terrace. Let me see if I have that picture at the next slide. Let's see. So on the lower, I know it's a little small, the lower picture in this slide shows some of the terracing in the downtown area, kind of just north of downtown near Chinatown, that we're going to start actually designing in earnest with the Army Corps of Engineers. It's going to be about a 4-year process for the first phase near Main Street, and then an 8-year process to design what we expect to be this connection to the LA State Historic Park, which is depicted in that lower image, which would include modification of the banks, access for people, reintroduction of habitat, a pretty intensive project. Again, the structure and integrity and armoring of the river banks will be largely maintained in a lot of ways, will be either rebuilt. This study and this project takes maintaining current levels of flood protection, flood risk management as a foundational constraint. So moving on from that specific major program of the Arbor project, we have a lot of other goals that we're moving on to improve access to the river and the connectedness of communities along the river. The LA Riverway is sort of the encompassing term for the bike paths and trail system along the river's banks that some of which have been implemented for years and are well used, and there are many gaps, though, that we still need to build. So what this slide is showing is in yellow, which is a little bit hard to see, but yellow, the pieces of the bike path system, which don't yet exist. And we have two sort of major chunks of gaps. We have the one through downtown, which I'm happy to say Metro is preparing to lead a design effort to complete that. And then you have a sort of set of gaps within the San Fernando Valley that are not yet built. And the City of LA Bureau of Engineering is right now completing sort of an alignment study on that area, and then we'll prepare to get into construction. And great news is that there is over $400 million from Measure M identified to complete that system. Most of it is identified for the downtown piece, and that is going to be a really challenging project. So we will have to find more funding for the valley piece, but there's $60 million identified to complete that project. So this the connection of this system is a huge priority for us. We find that the best way to get people for people to understand the river, appreciate the river, get into that then get deeper into these kinds of issues, is to bring them there and have them start to experience it in their daily lives. And on the right side of this image just shows a few of the bridges that are in planning and design, and actually all the across the river in various locations, and all these actually are funded for construction. So huge milestone project for the LA River is the G2 project, and G2 is a parcel name for a component of the overall Taylor Yard facility, Union Pacific Railroad facility. I'm sure many people here know what G2 is, so I won't dwell on it too much, but it's about a 40-acre property that was identified in our master plan and many other plans as a top priority to acquire, get into public hands, so we can do some of this restoration that we propose. So it's a centerpiece of the federal plan that I talked about. It's a centerpiece of our master plan. And I'm still thrilled when I get to say out loud that the city bought the parcel in March. So we own it.
Okay.
It's super exciting. And the Bureau of Engineering is now actually has just selected a design team to get started with the remediation planning, because it's going to need a lot of cleanup, and to do concepts for its design. So this is one of the primary locations that we now own. It's in public ownership, but we can actually really start to explore how we're going to really change channel. How are we going to modify these banks for the first time for the purpose of ecosystem. There's G2 and the setting of different habitat areas and community benefits around it. This is what it looks like today. So our design team is considering a lot of solutions, but this is really going to be a community-based design process. Really looking forward to that. So just a few more slides. The other things, please go ahead.
And I, for one, am not familiar with this project, so
Okay.
I don't want to take up too much time because most people here are. But is there an opportunity there to pick up some of the flows in the event? Because you did talk about the one of the foundations of the framework is to provide the same level of flood protection.
Mm-hmm.
But is there an opportunity on some of these projects to pick up some of the excess flows such that you could provide for channel modifications, modifications on lining in other portions of the river?
It's a great question. So it's one of the things that the federal project certainly looked at is, and also our master plan looked at is, if we wanted to really, really get ambitious with making some big, renaturalizing really large stretches of the river, what would we have to do for peak flow reduction in the watershed? The numbers are pretty massive. So at a site like, there's the Sepulveda Basin facility up in the middle of the valley, which holds a huge amount of stormwater. We would need 1, 2, maybe 3 more of those to really knock off the peak. I'm being a little bit, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but knock off the peak of the flows enough to really renaturalize huge stretches. So we have to be a bit more strategic, and I think somewhat limited maybe in our interventions. G2 in particular is probably not a place where we would be able to hold enough water to affect the peak in a way that would really open up a lot of opportunities, but it's certainly a place where we can do a lot of quality treatment, we think. We think we can pick up some major storm drains that actually run underneath the site and do some quality improvements, and by bringing some of the river flows through the site, do some quality improvements that way. So we're going to have to obviously balance sort of the storage versus the quality priorities for how we design it, but I think right now we're probably thinking quality is the better.
Treat and release is definitely going to be, because the remediation issues are going to be pretty severe.
Yeah.
At least it's just as a concept.
Yeah, I mean,
Great.
but
I mean, I don't know
it's
why I
tough
haven't heard
because
that
you want the
phrase a
whole
million
rest of the
times
San Fernando
before.
Valley to infiltrate as much as humanly possible, but there are
Yeah.
certain areas that just don't make sense,
Right.
and this would be one of them.
Well, apples, oranges, peaches, pears. It's not all.
Let me write that down. Hold on.
I didn't throw in chainsaws this time though.
So just a few more slides. I'll wrap up quickly. So
Great
as
picture.
part of our master plan goals, we also wanted to make sure that we're doing smart things with our city assets. Example is this shows the Lincoln Heights Jail, a city-owned out-of-service jail that issued an RFP out to private sector. Say, what would you do with this to help us, achieve some river goals and do some community mixed use? So we have actually a team now. This is a little outdated that said the RFP were due. We actually have the RFP responses in, and I've recommended a team. So that's going to be a great redevelopment project. The private proponents have been a huge part of, or a growing part really, of the revitalization movement. This slide here, which I borrowed from the LA Times because I thought they did a really nice job showing it, and some of the folks are in the room who work on this project, shows the Bending the River Back into the City project, which is led by Lauren Bond of Metabolic Studio. going to build a water wheel off channel to emulate the dozens that used to exist along the river, and have proposed a rubber dam in the river to generate the water level of the head to drive that wheel. Going to put some of that water to beneficial use for irrigation. So this is pretty complex, pretty exciting project near the Chinatown, Lincoln Heights area. And so we're just, we have to make sure that we're smart about the investments we're making in other ways too. We have transportation investments that are near the river, across the river, like 6th Street Bridge. Well, they better, help achieve our river goals. So that projects like that are going to integrate open space, are going to try to make some of the changes at the bank that we proposed in the master plan. We have to make sure that the river is not an afterthought in these projects. It's been an afterthought for too long. And we're seeing, this reflected in how the private sector and development proponents are treating the river too, turning their face to the river, treating it as an amenity, looking at the goals that we in the county and others have established and say, how can I help achieve those goals, right? And so it's incumbent on us, of course, to help make that possible. It's still rather challenging. We have rail to work with. We have, of course, all the permitting that has to be done, et cetera. But it's really encouraging to see that the sort of spectrum of proponents is sort of growing and growing.
This is a real proposed project right near that 6th Street.
So this project is on 670 Mesquite. This is put forward by VE Equities and the property owner Frank Gallo. The architect on this is Bjarke Ingels, if I pronounced that correctly. So, world-renowned architect. Very excited to help, to see how we can help achieve some of the things that they've depicted here. If you notice, by the river, sort of some decking for access. They've shown in this rendering some changes to the bank. We'll see, we'll have to explore that as with the Army Corps, but certainly this sort of decking and access is a huge part of helping us meet the goals that I mentioned earlier about closing these gaps in the riverway system. So that is sort of my overview. I really could probably talk for hours, but I know we don't have that time, so I'd be happy to answer any questions. I hope gives a good overview of sort of our goals.
No, that's great to be brought up to date.
I have a couple of just general questions. One is on maintenance of the channel and trash, graffiti, and security, homeless issues. Just if you could speak to any of those.
Sure. Yeah. So the maintenance of the river itself as sort of a piece of the flood, the flood risk infrastructure and the watershed falls to both the Army Corps of Engineers and LA County Flood Control District in different areas. It's sort of piecemealed. And so they have the primary responsibility for, inspecting and maintaining channel integrity. They respond to sort of graffiti in the channel itself. I know the Army Corps just finished a repair project in the Atwater Village area where there's a section of the toe of the concrete bank had eroded. We just finished a repair project there. So those two agencies, the federal government and the county, really have the lead role there. Now, the issue of people residing in the river, people experiencing homelessness who've chosen to find shelter in the river, that's obviously an extremely difficult and complex issue for all the agencies to deal with, and it's one of the issues that sort of highlights the jurisdictional complexity that we deal with every day. Everyone who works on river projects. If you're standing sort of in one location, you could be in the city's right of way, you take a few steps over, now the county's in charge, and then you go a few steps further beyond that, and it's the Army Corps. So you have sort of city, regional, federal jurisdiction all sort of on top of each other. So we do our best to coordinate and stay in close communication when we have specific issues that we're dealing with. If we get a report of a specific if there's a trash issue or if there's an encampment issue, we will try to work together to figure out who really should take the lead depending on where it is. I'll speak on behalf of the city. We are accelerating some of our resources towards the specific issue of homelessness. There is a thing in the city called a HOPE team, which coordinates our Bureau of Sanitation, LAPD, and the Homeless Services Authority of the JPA towards sort of encampment cleanup as well as outreach and service deployment. There will be a river-focused aspect of the Hope Team that's going to kick off in January. So details are still coming together on that, but that's going to provide at least some extra resources beyond what's already there in terms of dealing with that. But overall, the problem certainly, is out of scale with the resources that we currently have to address it. So, we're trying to, number one, scale up those resources. As you know, the mayor and the city and county have been doing, supported by the voters, as well as deploy them in, where they need to be by understanding the problem closely.
Just a quick question on the funding side. So you got, you had an authorization passed last year, so you guys are currently in the sort of appropriations fight of actually getting the dollars appropriated from Army Corps on that, right?
That is right, yes. Yeah, the project was authorized, which was a huge victory, yes, and we'll be going year by year, hoping to be in the president's budget and then see that appropriations come through from Congress. Yeah.
Great, thanks. It's great as a veteran of, I don't know how many iterations of LA River Task Forces. I'm 20 years out of date on a lot of this, so it's really been, the whole morning has been great, and this just puts a cherry on it, so thanks. I can see that I appreciate your recognition too, and I appreciate the vision in it, but also the recognition that it will take water too, either from stormwater capture coming in or out, and yet there are treatment options. It just, you wrap together the strands of what came before in terms of all the myriad choices, and the answer is going to be a little of this, a little of that, and figuring out how to manage through the complexity of it, but that's the nature of natural resource management everywhere. So it's nice to see the microcosm, and helpful, at least for us. You all may always be in the same room together, but I think helpful for us, for everybody who have spent the time to come together and give us an overview at once. And I know there's a lot more that we could have done, but I think it's a good start to set the context as we think about what we need to do next to be helpful partners in all this. Yeah, Dr.
I just wanted to add one point, which is that what was interesting about this incredible effort by the city in looking at the river is, in order to be eligible for funding for restoration purposes, there really wasn't the sort of water quality tie that typically you at the State Water Board would be looking at. And if it really turned into a water quality project, it never would have gotten approved by the feds. But the reality is, now that that has been approved, and there's all these other efforts related to watershed protection, looking at the river as a whole, the city, as well as other cities within the watershed, are trying to basically synthesize and integrate all of this together for the very first time. And so it really is a good time for you in the state to play a much more concerted role, because it would really help on the integration in the long run.
Great, that's great.
Yeah,
We have a couple of comments too, so.
Okay, I would just say we're all inheritors of, these legacy systems and structures that we had. And there probably wasn't enough intention kind of put in or discussion about the impacts of what it is that we were doing, and it's certainly not the understanding. So now here we find ourselves with what we've inherited, and it's about how do we kind of stitch it back together and kind of work intentionality into that. So
And
great
look at
work.
the whole watershed, not just the river.
Right.
Exactly.
Well put. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's go to public comment. I have two. Set it for 3 minutes. I have Bruce Resnick from the Los Angeles Waterkeeper, followed by Connor Everts with the Southern California Watershed Alliance. Afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm not seeing any time on here, so I'll just start going. My name is Bruce Resnick. I'm the executive director of Los Angeles Waterkeeper, a water watchdog group that I think most of you are pretty familiar with. I wanted to thank you for putting on this workshop today, as well as actually the 2-day workshop, and specifically for doing it in Los Angeles. You can see from the turnout, I think both yesterday and today, how many people are interested, and bringing it down to the local community is really vital. That being said, I'm going to have one small criticism, which is for all the great panels, and I learned a lot, and I've been working on this issue, I learned a lot today. it would have been great to have a panel, as long as there already has been, really of an NGO groups, and not only traditional environmental like Heal the Bay or Waterkeeper or others, but I would have loved a panel with Mark Lopez from East Yard Communities, who's around EJ at the lower, Friends of the LA River. I know there's some people in the audience for their community, and even some folks from the kayak community, the people that are really out there every day in there. So that being said, it's a small critique, and I'm very appreciative for the workshop. Obviously, I know there's going to be other hearings on this relating to the 1211 process and petitions and protests, and we're involved in that. So I'll try to keep my remarks very, very brief today. One thing, when we filed that protest, I wanted to clear up two quick things. One, because I've heard through the grapevine that somehow we don't support water recycling or we don't support any reduction in flows of the LA River, and I want to dispute both of those. I've spent much of my last 10 years of my career promoting water recycling, predominantly not purple pipe, but for potable reuse. And I certainly don't think that we can't look at reducing flows in the LA River. If today's workshop has shown anything, and I think the biggest challenge is how complex this issue is with the 51 miles. We're talking about flood control, water quality, a myriad of beneficial uses. What is the best use of water? Is it purple pipe? Is it not? LA River revitalization, complex regulatory streams of MS4s and WIMPs and EWIMPs and TMDLs, and the list goes on and on. And yet, despite some progress, we still break our decision-making very much up. And that was, frankly, one of the reasons for our protest of, okay, we want to pull some water out here. We want to pull some water out there. We have a lower LA River working group. We have an upper LA River working group. And we critically need to look at this as an entire holistic system. And I agree with a lot of what Dr. Gold said in his recommendations, and that flew by too quickly, but I would go back and look at his recommendations. And that's what we are here today to stress, that we think there absolutely needs to be a comprehensive ecological look at the LA River, including the flows and the myriad of balancing beneficial uses. We think it's best done by the State Water Board, working with the Regional Water Board for the same reasons of permittees and non-permittees. But even beyond that, we actually think it needs to be done as part of a comprehensive EIS, not a mitigated neg deck, but something that looks at the entire river as a whole, and something we think that the State Water Board should be the lead agency on, even though I'm sure it's not the most popular request here today. So thank you very much.
No, thank you very much.
Could you stay where you are, sir? Just 1 second. So I'm a little surprised. First of all, thank you for your comments. I'm a little surprised that we only have 2 commenters. And in light of the fact that you've been involved in this for a while, I'm just wondering if you could give us a little flavor for, and I realize you're not speaking for all the stakeholder groups that are advocating for various plans for river restoration, but if you could just give us a flavor for some of the various stakeholder groups that are involved, at least to the extent that you are, collaborating with some of the other groups.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to do that. And after the fact, I'll make a note to myself on my phone. I can actually send you, I've got a chart with like overlap, because there's groups that are working on the economic development part. There's groups around the ecological health. There's water monitoring groups. There's groups that are anti-gentrification and displacement. There's environmental justice. There's access, community engagement. There's a myriad. I can tell you some of the core groups, and I was actually at a meeting with a few of them yesterday talking about these very issues. So groups like Friends of the LA River, Heal the Bay, the Nature Conservancy, obviously LA Waterkeeper, Tree People is somewhat engaged. And then, like I said, we've got these myriad of groups working on the EJ side, East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice, I think I already said Friends of the LA River. So Stephen probably could answer better than me, but he's not going to. There's probably at least a couple dozen groups that are pretty heavily engaged in this. And like I said, Council for Watershed Health, yeah, I mean, you could go on and on. So, but I literally, at one point, because I was getting so confused, I had our watersheds person put together these tables, so I'll send that over.
Thank you for the opportunity. Connor Everett, Southern California Watershed Alliance. So I do represent many of those groups, and I'll identify a few others. But it's nice just to be able to take Expo downtown instead of drive to Sacramento for opportunity. I have kayaked down the LA River. I have bicycled multiple times on the LA River ride while I'm waiting for the LA River bike trail to be finished. And as a kid, I fished it until I graduated to steelhead fishing on Malibu Creek and Matilaha on the Ventura River. So this touches close to my concerns. I recognize it's a complex equation, but as long as we look at it as complex, we won't deal with it. And the reality is, I don't think there's a greater need for recreation, for contact with nature, and for all the multiple uses we can get out of the LA River. So there's been discussion on it, and like Felicia, I was on task force maybe 30 years ago, and we seem to be having the same discussion. So I'm interested at this point to see what we can do in my lifetime on these issues and actually see some accomplishments. We're seeing recycled water moving forward finally. LA traditionally was 2 to 3%. They do have an excellent wildlife refuge where I take my mother, an aging mother now in a wheelchair in the winter, the confluence of the 101 and 405, where hundreds of birds show up as a stop gap, including, I hear your favorite white pelicans, Felicia, because they're looking for fresh water and it doesn't exist in existing wetlands. But there's also an opportunity here for us to have a real discussion. Dry and flashy rivers in the Southwest are now part of the Clean Water Act because we did that kayak ride and made a documentary on it called Rock the Boat. There were times actually when the river was supposed to be dry and that helped clean it. And then when the flashy time came, it had other. So now we have water all year around, and there's certainly a demand. Every time we do a kayak announcement, it fills up and sells out right away. And who knows who else is down there. But there are people living within the river. They are not just, I don't think they're swimming, but they're bathing because that is their access to water and a place to clean. And we also have to realize the potential for flood and why the channelized happened, or the huge floods in the 30s show the force of water that we can have. And if you haven't read John McPhee's Forces of Nature, and it talks in one of the chapters about this area and the potential for flood, you should. So those are all the challenges, and yet I'd be amiss if I didn't mention Amigos de los Rios and their Emerald Necklace program, which is doing a series of beneficial parks within communities. Every Saturday, they have volunteer maintenance days. They're an excellent example of working within environmental justice communities. Also, the Arroyo Seco Foundation, LA River Project, and many others. So we're providing jobs, involving community, and getting people to understand their river. There are also development interests along the river. So it is changing, just like you may have noticed downtown LA has changed very quickly. The river is as well. Lastly, I will convene with Green LA a water discussion between Enviros on habitat and water supply, and I also hope to have here monthly, I co-chair also a water dialogue on this issue, and I hope to have participation of you all, and I hope sometime you all get a chance to kayak down the river or canoe with us too. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks so much, and for your years of work on it. Well, that was great. Thank you very much. I know that went longer than some people expected, but I appreciate it. And we could have done even more, but I appreciate people taking the time to get us up to speed, at least on these. I do remember one meeting in an LA task force meeting where someone asked why the Bureau of Sanitation was even there, which my response was, because we are the LA River. People had no idea where that water was coming from. It's sort of interesting how everybody knows a piece of it, but not the whole. So thank you for putting the whole, at least a little more together for us in a more contemporary frame than we had. And I guarantee you it's motivating to think about what we can do to be helpful moving forward.
Excited about the additional discussions that we'll be having then, and to the point about not having necessarily NGOs on another panel, this is just the first of, well, not even the first of many discussions. This is a discussion in a line of many discussions, so we look forward to the further ones.
Thank you very much. Our next item is item number 8. Let's wait a second so the folks who are only here for this one can clear out. For LA River, please go outside to continue the conversation. I'm glad you're all talking. You're all coming up with solutions, but take it out in the hallway.
And it doesn't make sense for them, because what you're gonna do, you're gonna give a different.
Hey, I'm just waiting to say hello to you.
All right? No, that's all right. They're all here.
Yeah, it's just gonna be a different sort of discussion than what you and
I know. It got switched around, but I don't know why. I think it was so that in case I had to leave, because I have a flight, but I'm going to be fine. All right. We're on to item number 8.
Oh, sorry.
What? Hey. Hey. All right. Oh yeah, let's get your names right, in the right place. Hi all. Welcome to LA. Sorry I can't take you to all my favorite little hole in the walls while we're down here. I'm sorry, I fell down on my tour guide role on this trip. My apologies. All right, item number 8.
Okay, so we're here today to get some input on some proposed amendments to the Proposition 1 Groundwater Grant Program guidelines. My name is Megan Tosney. I'm with the Division of Financial Assistance. I'm the Bond Section Chief. With me, I have John Davidson from the Office of Chief Counsel, Robert Reeves, who's the senior over the program, and Leslie Loudon, our Deputy Director. So just some quick background. Proposition 1 was passed by voters in November of 2014. It allocated $800 million for prevention and cleanup of contaminated groundwater. The board originally adopted the guidelines for the Prop 1 Groundwater Grant Program in May of 2016. The guidelines, in general, provide an outline of the process to solicit applications, criteria for evaluating proposals, and requirements that apply to funded projects. So at this time, we are finishing up our review of the proposals from round 1. Typical types of projects that we are awarding funds to are, well, we're doing both planning and construction. So construction projects, typical ones that we're seeing are wellhead treatment, extraction and treatment, groundwater well destruction, where those wells are acting as a conduit for contamination, and also source area cleanup. We are hoping to start the second round solicitation in early 2018. And so we've come to the some proposed amendments to the guidelines, generally just to provide additional clarification, streamline the process some. These are the areas that we're going to discuss today: project eligibility, grant maximums, reduced match requirements for funded projects, planning for future funding cycles, and then some small changes to the actual solicitation process. Okay, so with regard to project eligibility, some of the proposed changes are to provide clarification about certain eligible project types. So the proposed changes indicate that septic to sewer projects are eligible if they will prevent or reduce contamination of municipal or domestic wells in a disadvantaged community. And then we also provided some clarification regarding recycled water projects. We are seeing some projects that, one particular example is for seawater intrusion, where the project would use, recycled water to create a barrier to prevent intrusion. And we're proposing that those types of projects, the actual construction of the recycled water treatment piece would be a better fit for other funding programs within DFA, like the Recycled Water Program. And that we would potentially be able to supplement those funds and fund, for example, the injection wells themselves that are really providing that prevention benefit. And then we've elaborated a little bit more on this idea of a cleanup program. So the idea being that an eligible entity could receive funds to do some source area cleanup work on sort of a regional basis. We would be targeting it so that they can use the funding just to address sites that are under a cleanup order, but with a responsible party that is unable to pay for the total cost of cleanup. And so they would potentially be able to use the grant funds that they're receiving to support the responsible party in completing their cleanup efforts.
So like a water district who had a project that was
Right.
partially under control or somebody was paying for, but there was a need for a particular component that would help prevent migration or protect their water source.
Yes, or even some more regional type of entities that might be interested in this type of project. And then we also just provided clarification that we would be willing to fund regional planning efforts. This sort of goes along with the same concept to help identify and develop projects regionally. Okay, so as far as grant amounts, mostly what we're proposing are some grant maximums. So if you'll recall the initial version of the guidelines, there was a special type of project that was outlined, which was for drinking water treatment, where it wouldn't necessarily clean up the aquifer, but it was specifically just to treat the water for potable use. And those projects will remain at a $5 million cap. We're proposing for the septic to sewer implementation projects for disadvantaged communities that the cap for those types of projects is $8 million. And this is consistent with the caps that are in the SRF programs for those types of projects. And then this outlines the minimum and maximum grant amounts for the other types of groundwater projects that we're funding. So planning and implementation, the minimum is $100,000 and $500,000, but there is an option for deputy director approval below the minimum for good cause. And then the maximum for round one, we had $1 million maximum for planning, and we did not have a cap at all for the implementation projects. So for this draft amended version, we're suggesting a $2 million maximum for planning, consistent with the board's action yesterday on the round one projects, and a $50 million cap for implementation projects.
Now, these are expensive projects sometimes, and some of them are leveraging the ability to put recycled water or stormwater into a basin or leveraging other dollars. I know 50 is bigger than the 20 that you had in the recycled water fund. How did you pick 50? Because I know that's of concern for some folks in some of the bigger projects. Because we didn't have one before because we knew how big they were.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a couple of things we took into consideration. The highest award that we're expecting for round one was 46 million. And then generally, you know, we want to be able to spread the dollars around to benefit as many projects as possible. That's why we put caps generally into any of our funding programs. And we do always have the option, if there's a specific project that we think is, you know, worth considering giving more, we can come to the board and ask for you to consider that on a case-by-case basis.
All right, we'll talk about that a little bit more.
Okay, so reduced match, Prop 1 generally requires a 50% local cost share or match, and that can be reduced for projects that benefit disadvantaged communities. The proposed amendments give us a little bit more flexibility to reduce match in cases where the applicant themselves is not a disadvantaged community, but the project they're proposing would specifically benefit a disadvantaged community. And we also just give a little bit more guidance about the way that we typically look at defining the benefit area for a project for different types of projects, because it's going to be different for a prevention project compared to a source area cleanup and that sort of thing. These are some of the requirements that we're proposing for funded projects, specifically a technical advisory committee that would provide for multi-agency regulatory input on the projects that we're funding. Also a stakeholder advisory group for additional input from other entities interested in the project. A memorandum of understanding, which is would set up the framework for how the technical advisory committee operates and reviews and provides comments on project deliverables. And then the project assessment and evaluation plan is something we use to assess the performance of the projects. And then finally, we just added a bit of clarification regarding the technical, managerial, and financial assessment requirements to line them up more with the way that's done in the drinking water program. And this is basically planning for future funding cycles. We are planning to have solicitations approximately annually. We are awarding planning funds to several projects right now, and we know it's going to take them 2 to 3 years to develop their projects. So we have outlined our intent to reserve about $300 million for the 2020 solicitation, so that those projects will have a chance to compete for implementation funding. We do kind of caveat saying that we're going to have to weigh this against other demands and our approved funding authority, but that is our intent to try to make that effort. And then just as an informational piece here, we're estimating that after the awards from round one and considering that $300 million reserve, we would have about $250 million available for round two. So the solicitation process, when we did the solicitation for round one, we did a joint pre-application process with the site cleanup sub-account program. They were both very new programs, and we have since developed a pretty good understanding of what types of projects are a good fit for each of the programs, and so we feel that it would be better for applicants and for us to run separate tailored solicitation processes at this point and make sure we provide very good information up front about what types of projects are a good fit for this particular program and help direct them to other funding sources if they're not a good fit. Just as a way to kind of minimize the number of ineligible applications that we're reviewing and that people are wasting time on. And so this set of proposed guidelines outlines a two-step process for round two. It would be a concept proposal with a full proposal by invitation. As far as our timeline, we released the draft guidelines back in October. We had a public meeting in Sacramento last week, and the comment period will be ending at noon on Thursday, the 9th. And so our hope is to review all the incoming comments, make any additional changes to the amended guidelines, and bring them before the board for consideration in December, and then to open our round two solicitation in January.
Well, thank you. Questions before we open it? We have I didn't count, 6 comments. All right. Let's move to that. I'll have some questions, and there's a little bit of time for us to meet after. I'm sorry, my schedule didn't allow us to go over all this before this meeting. My fault. All right, I'm not gonna go through all six. I'll give them in order of 3 minutes. Arthur Pugsley from the Los Angeles Waterkeeper, I saw him. No, he's here. James Lesserman from the Castaic Lake Water Agency, followed by Melanie Mon-Schumacher from the Soquel Creek Water District. Those are our first 3. Hi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I'm Arthur Pugsley here, Senior Attorney from Los Angeles Waterkeeper. I just want to speak briefly as to the one item for item 8, the grant maximum for implementation. Can you hear this okay? Okay. Law is opposed to capping Prop 1 groundwater remediation grants at $50 million. We feel that the cap is arbitrary and disproportionately burdens large cities such as Los Angeles, whose residents disproportionately contribute to Prop 1 funds. The flip side of this is that cities such as LA can have a statewide impact from their sheer size by doing these types of larger groundwater remediation projects. One of the things that I don't think has been considered as part of the new guidelines is the potential for, say, indirect reductions of GHGs statewide to the extent that a groundwater remediation project in, say, the San Fernando Valley could displace the need for pumping water over the Tehachapi. So I think that bears some analysis before finalizing these guidelines. Again, as we mentioned, the San Fernando Valley comes to mind as the obvious example of a potentially socially and environmentally efficient expenditure of Prop 1 funds that we don't want to see arbitrarily capped. Thus, we support the current system, which does not have the limitation, and oppose the implementation of a cap. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lesserman, if I read that right, followed by Ms. Mon-Schumacher, followed by Ron Duncan, also from Soquel Creek Water District.
Chair Marcus and members of the board, thank you for letting me speak. I'm Jim Lesserman, a project manager with the Castaic Lake Water Agency, and we're a little bit frustrated. We have a project, it's been operational for 7 years. It removes perchlorate from the groundwater in the Santa Clarita Valley, and it's put to beneficial use. But one of the operating conditions requires us to have, after blending, the concentration of volatile organic compounds, VOC, to non-detect levels. This is part of a 97005 direct domestic use from an extremely impaired source. And so the VOCs are, even at the wellhead, less than the maximum contaminant level, the MCL. But the drinking water, Division of Drinking Water, which is now under your purview for the last 3 years, had us set an operational goal of that non-detect. And we do that 90% of the time. And 90% of the time we'll get you an A in organic chemistry class, but not here. 10% of the time we don't quite meet it. The concentrations are very low. So we sent a pre-application in last year, and we were encouraged. In fact, DDW encouraged us and suggested that we do this. And members of your staff came down and visited us. They were encouraging. But then last May, we got a letter saying we were disqualified because we were below the MCL. So you had one branch of your board encouraging us to do this, really in effect setting a new de facto MCL. But the Division of Financial Assistance said didn't qualify. And both parts of the organization were doing their job and following the rules, but we feel that perhaps we should qualify. And we do have some language we can suggest that you add to really the definition of contamination. We just add not even a whole sentence that would make it eligible. So we will submit those and hope that you consider that.
Thanks for flagging the issue. I actually spent a couple days on 97005 at a meeting with John and our DDW and other people to talk about this issue of how to look holistically at how to be able to use our groundwater basins, our contaminated groundwater basins as a water source. So we'll make sure we talk to DDW about it. Thank you for
considering
flagging.
it.
So
Hi,
Melanie's
I'm
not
not
here?
Melanie, but we are a package, and if it would be the chair's okay with you, if I could go first and Melanie would go second,
Well, certainly.
I think it'd help the understanding.
All
Okay,
right, that
yeah.
works. And then after you will be Liz Crossan from LA Mayor Garcetti's office, followed by Evelyn Cortez Davis from LADWP, who we've met before this morning.
So thank you for this opportunity. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Specifically, I think it's slide 5 that we're going to be commenting around, and it relates to the footnote on, footnote 6 on page 8, related to potentially limiting the use of recycled water for seawater intrusion barrier. That's what we're about. Again, I'm Ron Duncan with Soquel Creek Water District. I'm the general manager. We appreciate your time. We are 50,000 customers strong. Usually I say we're a medium agency, but when I look here, I'm going to say we're small.
Yeah, you can say you're
And
teensy weensy when you're
teensy
sitting in this
weensy
room.
maybe. I didn't want to
Everybody
go that far, but if we have to. We're next to the city of Santa Cruz down to Pajaro Valley along the Monterey Bay. 7 miles long, 3 miles inland, 100% groundwater, have no other sources. We're part of our GSA. We're rocking and rolling, getting our plan together as we speak. 90% residential. I'll just make note, 2 of our board members were on the regional water board, the central board, for many years, chairs, and they've served our board for over 15 years, so they're committed to sustainability and groundwater quality. The big gorilla in our room is seawater intrusion. We have it not just knocking at our door, but in our monitoring wells. If you go south, it's 3 miles inland. If you go down to Monterey, it's 8 miles inland. If you go around the world, it's in 70% of the coastal populated regions of the world that use groundwater. It's hard to stop. So our main focus is on preventing that groundwater from being contaminated, further contaminated by seawater intrusion. We have a community water plan that has a plethora, everything from conservation to stormwater recharge. Just to give you a hint, our per capita is 50 gallons per day. We've been drilling it in our people since 2003, and they have listened and they have risen to the occasion, because that is just our insurance policy to keep seawater intrusion from further moving in. So this brings me back to footnote 6 on page 8, and it has some language in there, and we understand, you know, we're not privy to everything, but you're doing a balancing act. You're trying to do the best you can with the money you have, and that's appreciated, and that's all that really can be asked. However, maybe there's an opportunity here to slightly tweak that language to add value to what you're trying to do to greater meet the intent of groundwater quality and sustainability. So we will be submitting a letter on this item, but it basically, some ideas are, could you eliminate, not eliminate recycle from the potential list of water? It's a means to an end, not an end in itself. And if you can't do that, are there other potential options, like we're a critically overdrafted basin, recognized by you. So is that another criteria that might fit if basins are critically overdrafted, or if they use, you know, less than, if they're rock stars in conservation? We've got a couple other things, but if there are some criteria that might help fit that couple percent that the regulations don't totally cover. Thank you very much.
So to more finely tune it.
Yeah, we'll
to
finally tune
a-
refinement to help meet your objectives. Thank you.
Thank you.
Melanie, I'm going to help you out.
Oh, wow, I didn't notice it did that. Janine, get us one of those.
For letting my boss go first.
Well, I'm just doing the cards the order they came in.
Again, thank you. I'm Melanie Mouse Schumacher with Soquel Creek Water District. I wanted to thank the board as well as staff. We've been working a lot over the last year with the staff up in Sacramento, specifically Robert and Megan and Aaron Crandall. They've been very accessible and very attentive as we work through our pre-application and final application for some planning money. I did want to voice, we went to Sacramento and we did appreciate many of the proposed language changes. Working on the other side, I know how hard it is to try and gather the information and put something together that everybody will like. And for most of the items in there, we really do like it. We like the streamlining application process, the increase in planning dollars to $2 million, setting aside some money for implementation projects if they get planning money. The one item that I do want to speak to, and we agree with Ron, is the footnote on the recycled water. And just to expand a little bit more on that, I have to pose the question, why? Why is that included in here? I'm a mother of 2 boys. Since they could talk, that's their favorite word. And now they're like in high school and they still say why. And why is a good thing? I used to hate it, but why is a good thing? Because it pushes boundaries and it makes you think, is this the right way to do something? Or could we do it differently? And I ask the question why, because I go, well, one, is this just the traditional method? If it was a recycled water project, you put it into the clean water program, and it was to, treat recycled water. But California and the state, we aren't thinking about water like that anymore. It's a one water holistic approach. Water is now not just to, treat it to prevent discharge and clean it up for prevention of, habitat or discharge NPDES. It's now to think about it to become potentially drinking water. So again, the why is it appropriate? The recycled water policy is now going through revisions. It specifically states that projects are only for that clean water. Is that going to be changed? I think right now you're a little premature in including that footnote, and you're creating a barrier versus really trying to create opportunities. You're trying to get this money out to communities, large ones like this, or teeny weeny ones. We have a water issue, and we're just trying to build projects. So if you can increase that streamlining process to actually not just do planning, but also put projects in, that would be very helpful for us. We appreciate any money that we can get that's outside, that reduces our ratepayers. Ron, I don't know if you mentioned this because I was nervous standing over there, but we have high water rates, and we would like to try and bring money in to help offset those costs because groundwater is our only source. I will just end with a quote, and this was a quote by Dr. Lucas Van Buren, the National Institute of Water Research in South Africa in 2005. Water should not be judged by history, but by its quality. So again, was it history on why you were creating and putting the projects or a component of the project into clean water, and do we still need to do that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, can I respond? Because I'm not sure, maybe you understand, but the reason that the footnote's there is that we have a whole nother program for recycled water. And so if we say, well, our groundwater program can build a recycled water plant, then that takes away from groundwater cleanup issues. So we have another section that we supply for recycled water plant. It's not that we're opposed to recycled water or we are tainting that source. We're saying, looking at their different funding sources, it makes sense to direct people to go to the recycled water portion of our funding as opposed to the groundwater cleanup funding. That's all.
Does that make people go to apply for two different grants for a combined project where you have the recycled water production, but then you have the injection wells?
So we work with applicants to deal with that part of the issue.
Yeah, I know we do that with DACs, yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't know if we have the FAST application for something that spans these two, do we? Oh, okay.
They're both solicited via FAST, and we would do whatever we could to streamline the process for them. But, ultimately, they probably would end up with 2 separate grant agreements from the 2 different programs ultimately.
But most of the project would be funded usually through the SRF program if they're going to take out a loan for that part. That's going to be the more rigorous application. And then like we do with the drinking water, we just supplement it from the Prop 1 groundwater program and add some grant money into that SRF loan project. So we have them, it's really, just one project manager, but we put the funding sources together. The SRF application is the more difficult one, and so that's the one that they would end up with.
Yeah, unless do we have any recycling grant money left?
Not right
I think
now.
that'd be gone right now, but more may come, right?
Right.
If SB 5 passes. Mm-hmm.
And there's a list, I think, of
Yes, we're working right now on the criteria, though, and we're looking at other funding sources as being one of the things that, you know, if they do have alternative funding to go in with their recycled water SRF project, that we make sure that it kind of moves them up in the queue
'Cause they
to
can
make sure they
leverage-
don't lose the other grant funding.
Oh, that too, right.
If some are IRWM funded or, you know, other funding sources too.
Well, great, thank you for
Thank you.
flagging that. We'll look forward to the comments tomorrow. Ms. Crossan, followed by Ms. Cortez Davis. Hi.
Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Liz Crossan. I'm here on behalf of Mayor Eric Garcetti. I'm the Deputy Chief Sustainability Officer in the Mayor's office, and I want to thank you for the opportunity. And really, I want to first acknowledge and thank you and your staff, especially at DFA, for working closely with the City of LA, in particular LA DWP, as we are embarking on this project that is, you know, quite groundbreaking and unique and different and big. You know, it's been, I think, a pleasure, and I really appreciate you guys troubleshooting with us on some of the operational and technical challenges that we've had. So thank you for that. I know that you've heard a lot about what the city's plans are for transitioning to a more local water supply. Our mayor has been very public about his commitment to make investments here in LA first. And so that's what I'm here to highlight today. The future water portfolio in LA is really about increasing our recycled water, our stormwater capture and infiltration, as well as cleaning up our groundwater basin. And really, it's the groundwater basin, the San Fernando Valley Basin, that's our keystone project. It's sort of what connects everything else. In order for us to have storage for the expansion of recycled water, in order for us to meet our MS4 obligations and infiltrate stormwater up in the valley, we really need the groundwater basin remediation projects to succeed and to succeed on schedule. And so it is, you know, that project, which I know you heard about in detail yesterday, that's, you know, nearly $600 million project divided into at least 4 different components with a construction completion date of 2021. It's really at a scale that I think, you know, will have statewide impacts because we really are demonstrating what it means to do integrated water management in Los Angeles. And by producing the millions of gallons, producing and storing millions of gallons of water more per day in LA, we are reducing our dependence on the Bay Delta and the overallocated Colorado River. And it's precisely because of the scale of what we're trying to achieve that I'm here to talk to you today, and it's about this, the proposal to put the $50 million cap on the implementation grant pot. So that is extremely concerning to the city of Los Angeles because of what we are trying to do is just, it's so big. And while I applaud and understand the need to geographically distribute the funds, we do believe that these, you know, voter-approved funds should really have the biggest impact possible for the state, and that shouldn't disproportionately burden big cities for doing big things. And so, you know, especially in the city where we are working on our own long-term reliability, we're also thinking about the state as a whole. And, you know, we have been awarded 2 planning grants, DWP has, for projects that we had intended to propose that would be greater than the $50 million cap. And so we do ask that you allow these projects to remain eligible without any future procedures or allowances so that we can all collectively, you know, proceed and progress the way that we have. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Just really quick,
Go
you
ahead.
said it was above 50 million, but what exactly is the cost of the projects that you're talking about?
So there are 4 projects, one which has already gone through round 1, which was 46 million, and I believe one is 100 and is estimated at about 100 million, and the other is in the 60s, but Evelyn, who's gonna follow me, knows the nitty-gritty of each one of those, so she can answer too.
So I'm just going to reiterate so that people remember that the $50 million cap that's proposed, that the board can make a decision on, isn't a cap on the projects, it's a cap on what Leslie can approve.
Right.
And so
Right.
that's a difference. And our thinking, rightfully or wrongfully, I just want you to know, is that we're not opposed to a $100 million project, which is actually a $200 million project when you talk about 50. But that's a big project, and we think the board might want to weigh in on that and not
Right.
have it be at the staff level, and that's why.
Thanks. No, that's good clarification. That's what I thought. Welcome back.
Thank you, Chair Marcus, board members and staff, thank you, and hello again.
First of all, I would like to commend the board and echo what Liz Crossan had to say about the amount of effort that's been put forth from the state board, and we are certainly appreciative of all of the collaboration that's taken place between the Division of Financial Assistance and Leslie's entire team, so thank you very much. We do have concerns about the $50 million grant cap that we just heard from Liz about, and more specifically, we will be submitting a formal letter with outlining a number of other specific concerns that we had, proposed language, but that really is at the core of our comments. We would be concerned, again, because while we understand that funding for implementation is not guaranteed at the planning stage, when we file those pre-applications for planning grants, the grant cap did not exist. The concept of a grant cap was not even being contemplated at the time, and so we're working way past that point now. So we would be very concerned about how, for applications requesting more than $50 million for implementation, which we expect to, how a waiver process would be processed and evaluated by the board. So we would have some specific questions about that. The second area of concern that we have, or questions that we have, is regarding project eligibility and the section on cleanup programs that was explained by Megan earlier, and it is regarding the provision that would allow groundwater grant program funding for groundwater cleanup to provide grants from an eligible grantee or an eligible entity to an otherwise non-eligible entity, and we would need a little bit better understanding on what the program would look like, and whether this would become whether there's any possibility that this would become a condition of grant funding for eligible entities, that this kind of, if this would become a requirement to incorporate such a program for this. And I don't know that we have enough information about the implementation of this cleanup program to understand it better, so we would want more information on
You guys want to just
that.
go ahead and clarify that now? I didn't hear it that way.
Is your question whether, as part of, for example, considering a proposal for one of the projects you guys are working on, we would also want you to be considering this programmatic approach?
Correct.
That's not our intention at this point. I mean, it was just opening up another type of proposal we might see in round two.
Right, and so the follow-on question to that, of course, is if the request would come from a non-eligible entity, then there would be, we assume, by default, the requirement for an eligible entity to participate in that part of it. And the question then that it's asking is, what about the match portion of that particular type of the part of the program? So we have a number of questions. We're going to send them all to you, but that's where our concern is coming from.
Generally, we're not anticipating the requests would come from the non-eligible entity. This is where an eligible entity takes it upon themselves to develop a program and identify sites in the region they want to work in, and which, parties are responsible for those sites, and they're worked out between them what they want that proposal to look like, and then the eligible entity comes to us with that proposal.
Okay. And that being the intent, I think it clarifies a little bit about the kinds of questions we will ask.
Okay.
Thank you. And then the third, if I may, the third question that we had was regarding performance monitoring. And this is one area that we've had many discussions with the staff, that there already is an expectation of some kind of post-construction monitoring for the projects to demonstrate their efficiency. There's new language that performance monitoring may be required for the useful life of the project, which in some cases may be 20 years or more. And we have found at DWP in our discussions about our proposals that monitoring costs can be significant, especially in the San Fernando Valley, given the depth of water and the complexity of the number of contaminants involved, et cetera. So we would be interested in finding out more about how the cost, how costs were factored into the inclusion of this requirement and the extent of the requirement, how it will be spelled out And then that's something that would be, I assume, worked out in funding agreements that are specific to an area. But in where they can be examined more holistically, these are the types of costs that are, because they're potentially long-term, that cannot be offset by grants, that are going to be borne by the entities proposing projects that could end up ultimately impacting the cost effectiveness of the project overall.
Can you explain that to me? What would you be sending I just don't understand. What would you be sending monitoring reports on to us that you wouldn't want to have to operate your project and make sure it was still working anyway?
So so there's an expectation, again, that there would be monitoring at some level, and we
Yeah.
already have requirements that, we have in order to operate the drinking water system in the first place. The extent of the post-construction monitoring that is contemplated in the guidelines is what we have questions about. It's the extent, because the monitoring, how you shape the monitoring program, the extent of the locations where samples, the frequencies, all of that, in a vast regional type of area like the San Fernando groundwater basin, for example. These are additive costs that we want to be able to get a handle on and be able to really evaluate fully at the beginning of the project. So we just want to better understand it. I think that we've worked with the staff up until now well on these types of questions, so we look forward to continuing to work with them.
And I think I can understand that. Looking at that, usually our post-construction monitoring would be some of your permit monitoring that's required by DDW. For these projects where you're looking at trying to clean up groundwater, I think that's what you're getting at. How much actual groundwater monitoring of the reduction of the plume are we looking at? And that is something that we would definitely have to work on during the initial scope so that you would understand, afterwards whether there were other requirements for groundwater monitoring, and each project is so different.
Yeah, right.
Because, RPs are monitoring, there's so many different entities working in the San Fernando Basin, so that we would have to look at that, and I agree that that would be something that we would work on early in the project, so you would know what the expectation was.
So we would just want to, have that information up front so we can put together as thorough a proposal as we can, especially going into implementation, which is where these costs are really going to enter. And with the larger projects that we're, contemplating now, the two projects that we were referring to earlier, the North Hollywood Central project that was described to the board members who were here yesterday, is in the range of $290 million. And the Tahunga centralized treatment project is in the range of $140 million. So they would both be in excess of the $50 million cap. So I just wanted to clarify that part. Thank you very much. I
Thanks,
appreciate it.
you did exactly what Liz said you would do. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
All right, thank you. Any further questions for staff now or later? All right. Well, we'll follow up. This was helpful in illuminating those issues, and with the comments coming in tomorrow, we can talk to you after they're in and you've amassed them all and figured out what to do, and we'll each talk to you like we usually do. Thank you. That was quite helpful. There's no action to be taken. So that was good. I'm assuming we don't have a closed session, though. We could do it, but we're missing our engineering wing. Now's the time to do it. That's right, but it would be a longer meeting than it is with the engineering wing. Okay. Now I may adjourn. Just making sure I got it right. Again, so thank you. This was lovely and helpful, and let me thank you for coming down, and if you're not leaving right away, as soon as this is over, I'm happy to tell you where to go eat. And then thank you to people who've joined us for the morning as well as for the afternoon session. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you all very much, and thanks to the staff for all the work. I know it takes a lot of work to be on the road.